Between the years of 1898 to 1946, the Philippines would be colonized by America and have its people and culture be redefined by the colonizers. Little did they know that the effects of the colonization would essentially reach out to future generations and to the Filipino Americans of modern day. And wouldn't you know, I'm one of them. As I was growing up in America, I was genuinely confused as to why there were times when my parents would educate me in making sure that I was striving to be a doctor because it made good money, or arguing against my parents when it came to simple matters such as going out. Because apparently if I wasn't making money, then I wasn't living out their dreams, and if I was doing things like staying out past bedtime, and also, fun fact, my bedtime was actually, let's just say, defined by the sun setting, you know, on some Lion King shit. If I wasn't home by a certain time at night, I was considered too American because I was essentially being rebellious. I was always at a crossroads of my identity, and I was not really sure what I wanted to be, and I was also not sure what my parents wanted me to be. Needless to say, these stresses affected my mental health, and I found that through my research, aka using my G number to use a J-Paul in a library. I see you. We all did it. We literally all did. If you didn't do it, you're not gonna, you know, you need a bibliography. I mean, come on. Back to I found that a bunch of these stresses are actually related to the process of culturation, which essentially is what we experience growing up. Getting used to a culture that frankly was always kind of at this crossroads. Can you stay there? Because we were always kind of at ends with two aspects of our identity, living as an American citizen and our ethical identity of being Filipino. The excessive need to meet the lofty standards of our parents essentially ignores mental health in favor of fitting into American society, and therein lies our problem, which I will now attempt to break down by going into how colonialism affects the understanding of mental health and also impacts different aspects of acculturation with things like making friends or coping mechanisms. And all of this, of course, I'm doing for a grade, maybe an A. I don't know, and it would be nice. Let's get this bunny off. So what this starts with is the process of colonization, because what essentially happens in this process is that the host country, the Philippines, has their culture and everything about them that makes them the Philippines deemed as unfit, savage, and very simple-minded by the colonizers, in this case, America. This in turn essentially kind of forms a very basic image of how the colonized people feel about how they live, essentially making them doubt and also want to favor everything that, you know, the American kind of culture, or the American colonizers in this case, bring to the table. This becomes internalized colonialism, a byproduct of this process. It essentially ends in a colonial mentality that favors anything that is Americanized and rejects everything that is Filipino without any hesitation and without any criticism. In other words, the reason why Filipino Americans experience acculturation stress in the first place is tied to the taught hatred of their ethnic culture. It also forces a need to copy the dominant group without understanding that the need to do so is completely fabricated by the society that was created around them. So where does this take us? Naturally, the evolution of acculturation should end somewhere in friendship, which basically means that when you don't know where to go, you talk to a friend for help, right? No. Now, before I start making friendships depressing, I of course will explain the reasoning why. As I mentioned before, an important part of getting jiggy with the times is the act of getting the jig on in the first place, basically making friends. And normally, friendships serve as a reliable source of information into the social norms that one would want to learn more about. But even though Filipino Americans are one of the biggest 3 growing Asian populations in the United States, there's data showing that a large portion of still have expressed suicidal ideation and depression in relative to the general population and some racial and ethnic groups. There's also a lack of data on how ethnically heterogeneous friendships, in other words, friendships made with people of other backgrounds and cultures, have their effects on mental health. So in short, friendships with people from different races actually do serve as a form of mental stress that can lead to anxiety and depression. This isn't to essentially put the blame on the people that Filipino Americans meet, but rather on the fact that the Filipino American experience, A, is affected by how colonialism has shaped our identity, and B, the immigration narrative of Filipino Americans is riddled with a bunch of discrimination, especially in the United States. Well, primarily in the United States, because land of the free, home of the brave, and the 444 Jack in the Box. Heck yeah. All this contribute to how we create our identities, and the discrepancies that come along the way are what cause anxiety and depression. For example, do you ever have that one Filipino uncle who just kind of harshly criticizes you and says like, hey, your Tagalog is very rusty, talk to me more. This actually plays into the idea of ethnical authenticity, which is connected to our heritage. In the face of adjusting to a new environment, this comes under attack because we want to have a common ground for our heritage and the place we live in. But the more conservative generation of Filipinos can see this behavior as kind of inadequate, especially when it comes to making friends with people outside of our cultural comfort zone. The discord that this creates within the family is tied to an identity crisis because, if anything, the older generation is the closest thing that we have to measure what it means to be Filipino. The failure to meet their standards, even when trying to adjust to a new lifestyle by meeting people who can actually help, turns into an anxiety in what we will call the intergroup, defined essentially by the people we identify based on our ethnic culture. In the case of Filipino Americans, this is seen in how our parents and essentially the generation before us who immigrated here become our standard for acceptance in the ethnic aspects of our identity. Again, I'm not trying to say that all friends are bad or making friends is a bad thing. Rather, our cross-sectional identity of being Filipino American is what causes a lot of the discord between ourselves that tires our mental capacitors. We get anxious if we can't basically keep up, and this can lead to depression if it continues for an extended period of time. Our friendships matter to us because it's how we learned about the community and culture that we're unfamiliar with. But that is always going to be a topic of criticism that will pester you in the back of your mind. So now, to kind of see how this is all going on in action, I do want to introduce a interview that I did that will kind of like expand like from here. Here we go. There. Enjoy. All right, so first question, and of course feel free. So the first question is, did you ever experience anxiety or depression as a result of growing up? So to kind of like, I mean, yeah. And if any time you need like clarity on the question, just let me know.
All right. I want to say yes to that. I feel like as a kid, there was a lot of different pressures on me, especially being kind of like this in-between generation that wasn't quite first generation Filipino American. Because just to preface this, my background is I was born in the Philippines, but I immigrated to America at the age of 5. And so I basically grew up here, but I still had a lot of connections to my cultural roots. And as I was getting older, there was a lot of different pressures, both from school and from family, to kind of maintain and also create different sort of identities for myself. Yeah. One where it was like, if I'm around family, it's like, yes, I'm Filipino, this is my pride, this is my heritage. The other part is when you're at school, it's like, I want to be seen as most common, like basically be as American as possible, to correct my accent, to speak English properly, but still maintain kind of the values that my Filipino parent wanted me to have, like, be as good as you can in whatever subject is there, and that in itself created different pressures for me. Growing up, there was definitely a lot of anxiety to kind of perform better than most of my classmates.
Big agree, yeah.
A lot of that kind of pushed me to take on more advanced classes, especially for my age, when we still had like standardized testing. If you guys remember, like the STAR testing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how old I am. Basically, in that era, when I took the test, I actually got marked as near like genius level, and so that created even more pressure for me to continuously perform at my best all the time, day in, day out. But essentially, a lot of things started to change as soon as I hit 6th grade. My mom and I actually, because of work, she had to relocate, and I was living with my aunt, and I took a entire school year out in Sacramento, and so that created a bit of disconnect between me and my mother.
Yeah.
Because I had basically spent like almost all of my life, well, all my life with my mom, and then for that 1 year I was disconnected with her. She would come in to visit every once in a while, but that was kind of the like bridge point. I didn't know how to reconnect with her at that point. But yeah, with experiencing depression, it was always kind of this weird sadness that just appeared out of nowhere. Like I could be in my room, I'd be playing video games, I'd be happy, and then all of a sudden the sadness would just hit me, and I wouldn't understand what it was, but it would drain all of my energy, and I'd end up in bed, and I'd just stay in bed. And my aunt basically just kind of reviewed it as, oh, you just don't want to do anything, you're being lazy.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that. Like, you know, it's kind of like this whole idea that just because you're depressed doesn't mean you don't have the physical energy to go out and do something. Because I know that's something that, you know, a lot of us kind of are questioning. You're like, why are you feeling down? You can just get up.
Yeah, you can. So. She was like, oh, open up your blinds, open the windows, go outside. But like, I literally had no energy to do any of that. Like I couldn't even pull myself out of bed.
I see.
And so at that point, I didn't understand what it was. I just knew that I was sad for some reason. I couldn't really figure it out.
Yeah. The next thing I wanted to ask on that topic is, you know, how did you, like, knowing that you at least had the symptoms of depression, but still being unsure, how did you still at least try to cope with the symptoms that you had? You know, like, especially knowing that we as the, you know, nerdy, or not nerdy generation, but knowing that we had also access to video games and media, you know, essentially what were your coping mechanisms, whether it be physical?
Yeah, there was
like, number one thing I would say, like, what's one thing you always went back to? Or
number one thing I always went back to was definitely escapism. Like, video games to me was just kind of like a pastime to like do things, to learn, to kind of understand the world around me through various concepts. But over time it became kind of like this focal point of like, I don't want to be me, I don't want to be in this situation, so I would move into playing video games to kind of escape that.
Yeah.
And that to me became like a constant place for me to just be like, it's okay to not have energy. Like, it's okay to be sad right now.
Yeah.
Because right now you're immersing yourself into the video game where you're not yourself. So
yeah. I mean, ironically enough, I know that, especially on the topic of games that, you know, that are basically escapist, ironically enough, a lot of these games do teach you things like, you know, inventory management and stamina, like, regen and magic regen, which I also feel like kind of, you know, it kind of helps you cope, because then you start building up strategies to apply it to the real world of how do I manage myself. So like, talk about that. Go ahead and
definitely. I came from a generation
of planes, of loud planes,
very loud planes. Let me tell you about
escaping the planes.
Way up high in the sky.
I want to throw that in so bad. Alright.
You can show that in the blooper reel.
I could, or like as like a joke, like towards the end.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm not given a set time, but I chose last just out of respect, because I know my shit's gonna be long.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's fine.
Rather not think about it because it's long, I think I should have gone first, because you know, everything is like.
But I think you ended off with something that people aren't expecting.
Yeah, that's true. All right, but yeah, so escapism and video games. Go ahead and explore that concept.
So I came from a generation of like old school JRPGs. Like, we're talking turn-based combat.
Yeah.
And so that to me was kind of like both a form of learning about agency, about learning how to motivate yourself and push yourself, and to learn more about yourself, but also as a form of growth, because in games, you're usually put in, or traditional JRPG games, you're put in a traditional leveling system where you start off weak, and through time you combat things, you gain experience, you're more equipped now to handle more difficult challenges as you go through the road, and then finally you'll hit kind of that final boss to end the story. And with that, it kind of gave me a sense of idea of like, yes, this is kind of how I want my story to be. I'm putting myself in the shoes of that character, and I'm going to do what he does or what she does, and that's to gain more experience, gain more levels, get different equipment to tackle different challenges. And I think that's one of the skill sets that kind of video games can teach you about depression, is that it doesn't matter how bad you're feeling, but what's important to hold is like,
Yeah.
to understand that you have the capacity to handle it.
To change, yeah.
And that there are actually spaces for you to go and help yourself.
Mental health in and of itself is a hard topic to cover because frankly there's a bunch of research that's starting to come up that starts detailing these experiences that we have as Filipino Americans and our experiences with anxiety and depression. But this video wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for those resources, and also with understanding our identity as immigrants and as Filipinos, and Filipinos essentially living in America. The main takeaway of all of this is that our identity as we understand it today is starting to take mental health into account, and we have the data to give us context that explains where it comes from. As we move forward from our understanding of mental health in the Filipino American community, it's always important to understand that we are a part of the ever-continuing movement of mental health awareness that takes place in places like this classroom. So with that being said, Wakanda forever, dog bless everybody.